This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Yesterday, I attended a memorial service for a dear friend who passed away at the age of 82. He had a lovely breakfast, sat down, picked up the sports page, nodded off, and he was gone. Those of us in the white hair contingent were all saying, that was a pretty good way to go, Raj. Way to go, and may we all go so peacefully. Well, what if going isn't so peaceful? Do we have the right to take our own lives here in Canada? Well, we do. But do we have the right to ask someone to help us on that journey? Not necessarily so. The Supreme Court is examining that question. They had a large contingent of people doing an intervention just recently, and that's the subject of our conversation today with Jim Stephenson, who is a local volunteer for dyingwithdignity.ca. It's such an important issue, Jim. How did you get involved?
Well, Wanda Morris, who is the executive director, the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada, is a good friend of mine, and it's an issue that's been of interest to me for a long time, and I've had some pretty strong opinions about it, and so it just looked like a chance to work with someone I respected on a topic I thought was important.
Have you had the misfortune to witness friends or family dying in a very unattractive, painful way?
I haven't personally, and I know that is the source of a lot of people's involvement in this. That they'll see someone who goes through a really horrid death, and they'll say, you know, that should not have happened to my friend, and I want to work for change. But I've been aware of people to whom this has happened, but not personal friends.
There are only a few jurisdictions in the world where assisted suicide is sanctioned. Belgium and Switzerland come to mind, and two very adjacent American states, Washington and Oregon.
That's right.
But my understanding, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, is that I can't go to Washington or Oregon for an assisted death because I'm not a citizen. I'm not a resident of those states.
That's correct. Now, there was an example of a woman moving from California to Oregon recently in order to qualify.
Well, quite a young woman.
Yes, and she had a brain tumor, and she was having seizures, which made her life just totally unbearable in her eyes. So there's a little bit of that, but I think she had to plan quite a bit ahead, and I'm not sure what the period of residency required is, but most of the states that have done this have tried to do it in a way that they would be serving their own citizens and not tourists, with the exception of Switzerland.
Where a Canadian has gone.
Yes, a Canadian.
And had a quiet, peaceful death surrounded by people she loved.
Right. And so Switzerland is almost unique in that you can be from any country and go to Switzerland and have an assisted death.
And other than the province of Quebec, we here in BC have been somewhat leaders on this file, haven't we?
Well, certainly in some respects, certainly in terms of public opinion.
Yes.
Dying with Dignity recently commissioned an Ipsos Reid poll, and we asked about this question in many different ways, because the answer depends a little bit on how the question is posed.
Absolutely.
But we asked in many ways, and across Canada, 84% of people were in favor. In BC, it was 87%. So we definitely lead in that way. And of course, the Sue Rodriguez case came from here, and the Carter Challenge, and Gloria Taylor came from BC as well. So we certainly have had an active involvement.
Yeah, so bring everybody up to date on the law. Was I correct in my opening in saying it is legal to take your own life?
That's correct.
It used to almost comically be a crime. I say comically because what are you going to do? Someone's trying to kill themselves and you're going to put them in jail for a while?
Yeah, or a capital offense.
Yeah.
No, it was somewhat ludicrous. And in the 70s, that changed,
Yes.
I believe through a court decision, so that it's now not illegal to commit suicide to end your life.
Now, in terms of assisted suicide, the government at the time, of some years ago, voted against okaying this. The Supreme Court a few years ago split the vote, and we're still against it 5-4. But as we know, time changes everything.
Right.
So what was the recent intervention? How did it go, and when can we expect some answer?
Well, the Sue Rodriguez case, which was where the court split 5-4, and I understand one of the 5 is now saying that were it today, he would have voted differently.
Oh dear.
And what's happened in the last 20 years is that we now do have 10 jurisdictions that provide for some form of assisted dying. And the evidence from those jurisdictions is that the concerns that we wouldn't be able to protect the vulnerable, or it would run amok, or there would be some sort of slippery slope, just have not panned out. The evidence is very clear. And so, with that additional experience, it seems like it's a good time to have another look at it. And so we now have the Carter case along with Gloria Taylor. That originally was decided by Justice Smith in the BC Supreme Court, and she decided in favor of the plaintiff that it was a violation of constitutional rights. And so then it went to the appeals court, and the appeals court basically said that they were not authorized to overrule the Rodriguez case, that only the Supreme Court could do that. So now it is before the Supreme Court. Hearings were held on October 15th. And there were a number of demonstrations and interventions in Ottawa and in many other cities where people expressed their views. And now the justices are mulling it over, and they will reach a decision in, as you said, in the spring, most likely.
Looking at the formal document of submission to the Supreme Court, there was a list, it seemed almost pages long, of organizations who are arguing in favor of changing the law to approve of assisted dying. And that list included Dying with Dignity and so on. But lots of organizations, including, interestingly enough, organizations associated with traditional churches.
Yes. Well, on the religious, amongst religious groups, there is some divided opinion.
I bet.
And, but, you know, a lot of religious people have a very strong view that there should not be unnecessary suffering. And that, at bottom, is what this issue is about. And so with proper safeguards that can protect the vulnerable and make this a safe thing for society to offer, many religious people also support it.
When this young lady from California moved up to, where did she go? To Washington?
To Oregon.
To Oregon.
Yes.
So her case got a lot of public attention. And when that happened, a young man who, I can't remember if he was a priest or a novitiate or a monk, but in any event, he was associated with some arm of the Catholic Church. And he wrote extensively saying, I'm dying of cancer also, and it's not fun.
Yes.
But I believe that this is in God's hands, and I shouldn't take my life.
Yes.
So do you hear this often from people who have very devout views?
Well, certainly we have never said that people should end their lives. What we're saying is that people should have a choice. And I think it's wonderful that man who, another person who had a similar situation, brain cancer, and perhaps was quite uncomfortable, but decided that he would choose not to do it. He would let, nature take its course, and that's perfectly fine. I think that's great.
And
but what we're saying is that if someone decides they don't want to suffer and it could be alleviated, then they should be able to.
And if anybody's ever visited a palliative care ward, they will see very quickly that the exact opposite happens. People are not allowed to suffer You know, the whole point of a palliative care ward is that people are comforted in every possible way.
Yes.
If the end seems fairly imminent.
Yes, and palliative care meets the needs of many people. In fact, the great majority of people dying, that
Yes.
their pain symptoms can be controlled. They can have a place where they can have dignity and be with their families, not have any more medical interventions,
Yes.
and drift off, and that's fine. But there are some conditions where traditional pain medication or treatment management cannot address the issue, and that can include
You mean
things
because
like,
the pain is so intense?
well, not necessarily. It's not always pain that's the cause of the suffering.
Okay.
So the woman with the brain tumor was having seizures
Yes,
that
yes,
were
yes.
very, very
Yeah. You could
upsetting.
choke or not
that's
breathe.
Right, exactly.
Yes, yes.
That were to her was suffering. And there's an example of Angelica Flowers in Australia, who
Yes.
had colon cancer, and she had bowel obstruction. And
Yes.
that wasn't a question of pain. That
Yes.
was something much more horrendous. So there are times when palliative care can't do the job.
Yes.
There are some forms of suffering that only the end of life can resolve. And so it's not actually that frequent.
Yes.
But what we're saying is that people in those situations should have that. And while it's not that frequent, it's people just knowing that they have that option, it creates peace of mind for many, many more people than end up using it.
I'm sure there must be doctors watching this who are rolling their eyes because they know that for many, many doctors, there's the whole issue of do not resuscitate and do not prolong.
Yes.
And we all, we'll talk about this, we'll take a break in a moment, but we can write living wills, can we not?
Oh, we can.
Yeah, and we can say, look, at a certain point, just don't feed me anymore.
Yes, you can do that as well, although the recent decision with Margot Bentley in D.C. suggested that feeding might be considered basic care instead of medical care. And so that might not work as clearly. In Quebec, the new legislation makes that very clear that it's medical care.
But many doctors, all over Canada, all over the world, but we're thinking about Canada, have practiced for many years.
Oh, yes.
Saying, look, your dad's going. We don't think any more medical intervention is going to help.
Yes.
And he would like to go.
Yes. And as long as the absence of medical care will lead to death, that's fine. But there are some forms of death where there can be suffering for a long period of time.
Yes.
And even if you discontinue all medical care, they'll still go on and they'll still suffer. And so that's where this one additional step of having assistance.
Gruesome subject, I know, folks, but a necessary one. We're all going there eventually. The question is, how are we going to get on that bus? We'll take a little break here, give you an opportunity to send us a note at davidberner.com is our website, and also a chance for those lovely people who support us to say hello here on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Back with Jim Stephenson and Dying with Dignity in just a moment. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. I was saying just as we go to break that this is a kind of gruesome subject, but it isn't really. It's a real subject. It's one. It's a conversation that we have to have. And there was an article in the press recently that these kinds of conversations are happening more frequently. In a way, we're kind of leading the discussion. I wonder how many people are comfortable, Jim Stephenson, sitting down with their families and talking about when the end inevitably shows up.
Right.
Of course, many of us, will die suddenly. We'll just drop dead of a heart attack, or we'll be killed in a car crash or something dreadful. But if it's a question of illness, we have to have those conversations, don't we? And I think we have to have them even with children.
Well, it's very helpful to have those conversations, and I think more and more people are comfortable with having that topic, both the older people, and also families and children. Some people just can't go there and don't want to go there, and you have to respect that. But there are some real benefits for being able to have a conversation about what you would like, and maybe in terms of whether you want to have extreme measures or whether you would just like to let go, whether you like a quiet death, whether you'd like your death to be at home. And a lot of people plan their services, their celebrations of life before they go. And so, I think it's a very healthy thing. But you have to recognize that some people just aren't comfortable going there, and that's all right as well.
Let's talk about the fears, substantial, real or otherwise. The fears of this discussion, not the fears of death, but there has been the ongoing fear that you mentioned the slippery slope, that we open a door to family heirs saying, well, let's kill off grandma because she's got some nice gold candlesticks or whatever, and we're going to inherit something, and she's had the biscuit anyway. To be crude. So there is that fear that avaricious relatives might, interfere and end someone's life needlessly.
Yeah, and the guidelines in the jurisdictions that you mentioned in Europe and in the U.S., they have explicit statements that the doctors who are required to determine that the person is making a conscious and uninfluenced choice, that they need to look at the family, need to talk to the family, and they need to look for any evidence of undue influence. And so the safeguards can help and have proven effective in preventing this. But it is clearly a danger, and it needs to be managed.
And one of the phrases, of course, that always comes up is of sound mind.
Yes.
So how do we determine that? I mean, it's difficult enough to determine if you and I and Simon are of sound mind. We're all mildly crazy. So how do we determine if someone lying in a hospital bed or at home?
Well, for a long time, Canadians have had the right to refuse medical treatment and to discontinue medical treatment, and that also requires a determination of competency. So there are well-established procedures, both in the law and in medical practice, for making these determinations. So we don't have to do anything new in this case.
There are ways to determine
there are ways to do it.
Uncle Jack is of sound mind.
Yeah, and it's not whether you can do math and things like that. The question, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer nor a doctor, but the question is, as I understand it, do you understand the consequences, and do you understand the decision you're making, and do you have the capability to make that in a sound way?
Yeah, and you'd hate to have to involve a whole bunch of, you'd want to involve some people, but you wouldn't want a whole team of lawyers arguing over your deathbed.
No, but there are protocols to follow to make this determination. It's done every day. It's done in the medical context. So, that's something that we already have.
When I had my most recent angioplasty, which was 5 years ago, you're awake during this process, but you're sort of on happy juice, so you're not feeling too much. The operating doctor said, I may have to send you back to your room, Mr. Berner, and schedule you for open heart surgery. And I said, well, that's attractive. And he said, okay, let me look around for a while. I said, that's good. I like looking around. So 10 minutes later, he said, okay, we're good. We're going to put in 2 more stents. Right. And you're out of here. Well, so I said to my cardio a week later, I said, if that ever happens again, can I refuse? Can I say, you're not going to do open heart till I talk to my cardiac guy? And he said, absolutely right.
Absolutely. Yes.
You can say, no thanks, that's not what I'm going to do just yet.
Right, and you have some other rights. I mean, you have the rights to a second opinion.
Yes.
And that can be sort of difficult to do. Some doctors resist that.
Yes.
But if you say to the doctor that I'm having a hard time trying to make up my mind,
yes.
and I'm wondering if you could suggest another doctor I might talk to about
yes.
it, frequently they'll be very helpful and do that. And if you're taking an experimental medication,
yes.
There's a protocol, and sometimes there's a pressure that don't discontinue because it might spoil our study.
Yes.
But you have a right to do that. If you have side effects that you're uncomfortable with, then you have the right to discontinue your medical treatment, whether it's experimental or conventional.
Have you heard of two things that suddenly struck me as we get into this conversation? One is, have you heard of some people who are considering assisted suicide or suicide, really struggling with guilt? Like, I feel this is what I want to do, but I feel I'm doing the wrong thing, and I feel I'm cheating my family. And
well, I've heard that suggested. I haven't
yes.
encountered it directly.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a genuine feeling of guilt there, or if there's a guilt trip, someone's lying on them, or what's going on.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is a decision that a person should make with a lot of deliberation, a lot of care, and taking all those things into concern. But I think if someone is really suffering at the end of life and they don't have that long to go anyway, that the guilt part is not a major concern.
And have you heard of people in a similar circumstance asking for a clergy of whatever kind to come and discuss this, and father or rabbi or imam, am I doing the right thing? Is this an offense to God? This is what I think is correct for me. Do you think God forgives me for this?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think people should feel free to do that. And,
yes.
Ministers and priests, religious people in generally have a lot of training in counseling, and
yes.
they're good people to talk to anyway. And but you also want to bring in these cultural aspects as well.
Absolutely. So here's BC Civil Liberties Association argues it's unfair to discriminate against those who suffer from, for example, degenerative diseases, or physically unable to end their own lives when able-bodied, or those opting to curtail their kidney dialysis, which you mentioned.
Yes.
You said during the break that if I'm on kidney dialysis and I want to say enough, I can just stop.
You can discontinue whenever you want, and you'll be gone in a week, and they'll keep you comfortable.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It is a kind of charter right discrimination to say to someone who is physically incapable, someone who might otherwise kill themselves or take their life, and they can't. Well, they want someone to help them.
Well, this is a situation faced by Gloria Taylor.
Yes.
And the real tragedy of it is that there are people who realize that they have the right to take their own lives.
Yes.
But if they wait until their disease advances to the point where they can't do it themselves,
yes.
then they're out of luck without if someone helps them, they can go to jail for 14 years under the Canadian laws now. And so what happens is that people frequently will go sooner than they would have if they could have had help. And that's really unfair.
I think for many of us, one of the worst fears we have is being utterly disabled to the point of not being able to communicate.
Yes.
And being back here in our heads somewhere, quite aware of what's going on.
Yes.
But just completely physically wrecked. And we can't say, look, please put an end to this.
No.
What a horror show.
No, you can't under the current legislation, but under the new Quebec legislation, you would be able to specify circumstances, or particularly in Holland and Belgium, you can just basically say, if I don't recognize my family, or if I'm unable to communicate, I'm unable to feed myself, then I'd like to have an injection.
Let's say we just have a moment or two left. Let's say the Supreme Court changes its position and your side wins, doctor-assisted suicide or assisted suicide becomes a legality across Canada. You don't expect a sudden rash of suicides, do you?
Oh, absolutely not. And in the jurisdictions where this happens, it's actually a very small fraction of people. In most cases, palliative care will take care of people. It's just these rare circumstances that this is required. So I don't expect that, and in jurisdictions where it's now legal, the incidence has not gone up.
And let's say the Supreme Court does vote in your favor, that doesn't mean the end of volunteering for dying with dignity. There's still work to be done.
Well, in several ways. First of all, the Supreme Court we hope, will rule that the current laws are unconstitutional, and will send it back to Parliament to rewrite the laws. This has happened recently with prostitution, and a lot of people feel that the new law isn't constitutional either. So there will be some give and take there. And furthermore, even in countries, I recently went to a conference, and there are organizations like us in Holland and Belgium that have very effective legislation, but there's still, people need help finding their way through and counseling and everything, so there's likely a role to be played for
And what do you make of the many websites you can easily just put on Google search help me to die, or how do I die, or something, and you'll have, the Hemlock Society. I just made that up. Is it the Hemlock Society?
Yeah, there is a Hemlock Society, yes.
So you'll have people like the Hemlock Society and other people who will give you advice on how to take your life.
Yes. Well, and some of those are genuinely helpful. And
we would
some
hope.
of them, some of them are just, there are now sites in Mexico and China that are selling medications for ending your life like they do Viagra, and some of them legitimate and some of them aren't.
Jim Stephenson, many thanks.
Thank you very much, David.
Good work you're doing.
Enjoyed being here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Okay, that's it, folks, for this conversation. Next week, Laura Jones will join us from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, or Businesses. Is there anything more difficult, next to dying, anything more difficult than trying to run a small business in Canada between taxes and rents on property? Ouch. Thanks for being with us. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon here on Shaw Community Television Cable 4. Good night.